Part 1. The stars had watched humanity for a very long time before anyone decided to say hello. The hegemony was old. Their empire stretched across 3,000 star systems, and they had ruled those stars for longer than humans had been walking upright. They had seen many species rise from their birth worlds, reach toward the sky, and then either join the hegemony or disappear. There was no third option. There had never needed to be. When scouts first detected radio signals coming from a small yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy, they did what they always did. They watched, they listened, they learned. What they learned made them nervous. The humans were violent, not just violent in the way that young species sometimes were, fighting over territory or resources until they grew wise enough to stop. The humans were violent in ways that seemed built into their very bones. They fought wars over ideas. They killed each other over words written in old books. They developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet and then built more of them, just in case. The observers filed their reports with growing unease. One analyst wrote that the humans seemed to treat violence the way other species treated breathing. It was not something they chose to do. It was simply what they were. The hegemony debated for decades about what to do with this strange, angry little species. Some wanted to destroy them before they could spread beyond their home world. Others argued that the humans would probably destroy themselves, given enough time. A smaller group suggested making contact and bringing the humans into the hegemony's fold, where they could be watched and controlled. In the end, economics won the argument, as it usually did. Earth was rich in rare metals. The humans had developed surprisingly clever technology, and despite their violence, they had shown the ability to cooperate when they wanted to. Perhaps they could be useful. Ambassador A was chosen to lead the contact mission. She was, which meant she stood 7 feet tall and looked something like a praying mantis made of black chitin and sharp angles. Her mandibles could crush stone. Her species had evolved as apex predators on a world where everything wanted to eat everything else. Very little in the galaxy frightened A. The humans, she had decided, were worth being cautious about. Her ship descended through Earth's atmosphere on a spring morning and landed in a city called Geneva. Thousands of humans had gathered to watch. A emerged from her vessel with an escort of armed guards and found a delegation of human leaders waiting for her on a red carpet. They were so small, so soft. Their skin had no armor. Their teeth were blunt and useless for anything but chewing plants. A could have killed any of them with a single swipe of her forelimbs. And yet she noticed things. The human soldiers standing at attention had eyes that never stopped moving, tracking every member of her delegation with quiet intensity. The human leader who stepped forward to shake her manipulator appendage had calluses on his palms and a scar on his jaw. His smile was warm, but his gaze was measuring her the same way she was measuring him. These were not prey animals, A realized. These were predators wearing very convincing disguises. The first year of contact went well. The humans were eager to learn about the wider galaxy. They shared their art, their music, their food, attended concerts and ate at restaurants and visited museums filled with human history. She saw paintings of such beauty that they made her compound eyes ache. She heard music that moved her in ways she had not known she could be moved. She also saw the other museums, the ones filled with weapons and wars, the ones that documented every terrible thing humans had ever done to each other, preserved behind glass as if they were proud of it. One exhibit showed the weapon that had destroyed an entire city in a flash of nuclear fire. The humans had kept the shadows of people burned into walls, actual shadows of actual people who had died in an instant. They displayed these horrors right next to their most beautiful creations, as if both were equally important to understanding what they were. A filed report after report trying to explain what she was seeing. The humans were not just violent, she wrote. They were aware of their violence. They studied it. They taught their children about it. They seemed to believe that understanding their capacity for destruction was the only way to control it. She recommended extreme caution in all dealings with humanity. She suggested slow integration, careful monitoring, and above all, respect for human autonomy. The hegemony thanked her for her service and ignored every word she said. Trade agreements were signed. The humans were so grateful for access to alien technology that they agreed to almost anything. They let corporations mine their asteroid belt. They accepted loans that they did not fully understand. They signed contracts written in languages they had only just learned to read. Within 10 years, most of humanity's economy was tangled up in hegemony systems. Human colonies spread to a dozen new worlds, all of them technically independent but actually dependent on alien goodwill for everything from medicine to fuel. The humans celebrated their expansion into the stars without realizing they had traded one kind of cage for another. Who had been promoted to senior intelligence analyst, watched it all happen with growing dread. She tried to warn her superiors that the humans were not as foolish as they appeared. The way they were learning alien languages too quickly. The way human engineers were reverse engineering hegemony technology instead of just using it. The way human military officers asked very specific questions about fleet deployments and jump gate coordinates, always framed as innocent curiosity. Nobody listened. The humans were contained. The humans were useful. The humans were, despite their violent history, being remarkably cooperative. Then came New Hokkaido. It was a small colony, barely 40,000 people, on a world that happened to sit on top of the richest deposit of quantum crystals in 3 sectors. A hegemony mining consortium had purchased the extraction rights from the colonial government years before. Now they were ready to begin operations. There was just one problem: the humans were in the way. The consortium's representative was a species that looked like a ball of writhing tentacles with a single large eye in the center. He was used to delivering bad news. He had told dozens of species that they needed to relocate for the good of the hegemony. Most of them cried or argued briefly before accepting the inevitable. Governor did neither. She was 60 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a face that had been weathered by decades of frontier living. She listened to the consortium's demands without expression. When the finished explaining that her people had 90 days to abandon their homes, she nodded slowly. Then she asked for 3 days to prepare her people for the move. The consortium representative agreed immediately. He had expected negotiations. He had expected appeals. He had expected the usual performance of grief and outrage that preceded surrender. 3 days was nothing. On the first day, Governor called a meeting of every person on the colony. She explained what was happening. She explained what the hegemony had done to other species who refused to move. She explained the math of their situation, which was very simple. They were 40,000 people with no military fleet, facing an empire of trillions. Then she asked them what they wanted to do. On the second day, the children were quietly evacuated to underground shelters that had been dug years before. The official records called them emergency bunkers for natural disasters. They were much larger and much deeper than emergency bunkers needed to be. On the third night, every landing craft belonging to the mining consortium exploded. It happened at exactly midnight local time. 16 ships, scattered across 3 landing fields, all destroyed in the same instant. The orbital shuttle depot, which was supposed to ferry equipment down from the consortium's transport vessels, vanished in a ball of fire visible from the planet's surface. Governor's face appeared on every screen in the sector. She looked tired but calm, like a woman who had made peace with what she was about to do. Her message was short. She said that the people of New Hokkaido would not be moved. She said that they would not be sold. She said that they knew what would come next, and they were ready for it. She said that they would not be the last humans to make this choice. Then she looked directly into the camera, and her voice dropped to something quiet and cold. She said that the hegemony had called humans savages for as long as they had known them. She said that the hegemony had built their entire strategy around the assumption that humans were violent animals who could be frightened into obedience. She smiled, and it was not a nice smile. She said that the hegemony was about to find out what happened when humans decided to prove them right. The transmission ended. Across human space, on every colony and station and ship, people who had been waiting for exactly this moment began to move. They called it the kindling, and the galaxy was about to burn. Part 2. Admiral had crushed rebellions on 37 worlds. He had bombarded cities into glass. He had accepted the surrender of species who had been proud and free for 10,000 years before the hegemony arrived. He was very good at his job, and his job was making people understand that resistance was not just futile but stupid. When the hegemony high command ordered him to pacify New Hokkaido, he considered it a waste of his talents. 40,000 colonists with no military fleet, no orbital defenses, no allies. He could handle this with one hand tied behind his back. He assembled a battle group of 12 warships anyway, because the high command wanted to make an example. The humans elsewhere in the galaxy needed to see what happened to rebels. They needed to understand that their little moment of defiance would end in ash and silence. His fleet arrived in the new Hokkaido system 4 days after Governor's broadcast. He did not bother with subtlety. His ships took up bombardment positions in high orbit, their weapons pointed directly at the colonial capital. He sent his ultimatum on an open channel, so everyone could hear it. The humans had 1 hour to surrender the terrorists responsible for the destruction of the mining consortium's assets. If they refused, would begin orbital strikes on civilian population centers. He would continue until the humans either surrendered or died. He did not particularly care which. Governor's response came exactly 59 minutes later. She said that the people of New Hokkaido had already made their choice. She said that was welcome to try to take their world. She said that she hoped he had brought enough ships. Then every scanner in his fleet started screaming. The first explosions happened in the empty space between his ships. Mining charges, the sensors reported. Industrial equipment designed to crack asteroids, repurposed into orbital mines and scattered through the engagement zone in patterns that made no sense until suddenly they made perfect sense. His flagship shuddered as a mine detonated against her shields. Another ship was not so lucky. The destroyer Vigilant took 3 direct hits before her captain could react. Her hull breached in a dozen places, and she began to tumble, dead in space. Ordered and immediate combat spread. His ships began to move apart, trying to get clear of the minefield. That was when the civilian transports attacked. There had been nearly 100 small ships in system when the fleet arrived. Freighters, passenger shuttles, mining vessels. The kind of traffic you would expect around any inhabited world. Sensors had marked them as non-combatants and ignored them. That was a mistake. The civilian ships had been hiding weapons. Missile batteries bolted onto cargo holds, jury-rigged into passenger compartments. Nothing that should have threatened a hegemony warship, but the humans were not trying to win a fair fight. They were trying to create chaos. Missiles streaked toward the fleet from every direction. Most of them were shot down by point defense systems. A few got through. The cruiser Eternal Dominance lost her main sensor array to a lucky hit. The battleship Righteous Fury took a round through her engine housing and lost a quarter of her speed. Was still not worried. These were pinpricks, annoyances. His ships had been built to absorb much worse. He ordered his fleet to ignore the civilian harassment and focus on achieving bombardment position. That was when the communication satellites turned out to be kinetic impactors. The colony had launched them years before, officially to provide global network coverage. They had been hanging in orbit ever since, quiet and unassuming. Now they lit their engines and dove toward the hegemony fleet at acceleration rates that should have been impossible for their size. The destroyer Absolute Judgment took the first hit. A satellite traveling at 4% of light speed punched through her shields like they were not there and continued through her hull, leaving a hole you could have flown a shuttle through. The ship did not explode. She simply stopped existing in any meaningful sense. 3 more ships died in the next 2 minutes. The cruiser Pride of, the destroyer's swift response and iron will. Their shields, designed to stop energy weapons and conventional projectiles, could not handle objects moving at relativistic speeds. Finally gave the order to retreat. It was too late. The human ships had been positioning themselves during the chaos, not the civilian freighters with their improvised weapons. Real warships, ships that had been hiding in the outer system, running silent, waiting for exactly this moment. They were not pretty ships. They were ugly things, built in secret shipyards on backwater moons, assembled from stolen blueprints and salvaged components. But they had one thing that hegemony ships did not have: crews who were willing to die. The destroyer Rising Sun threw herself into the path of the battleship Glorious Victory, her engines overloading deliberately. The explosion tore both ships apart. The cruiser Never Forget rammed the carrier Absolute Authority at full speed, sacrificing her entire crew to take out the hegemony's fighter capacity. Watched in horror as his fleet came apart around him. He had commanded ships for 40 years. He had never seen anything like this. No species fought like this. No sane creature threw their lives away with such abandon. The humans did not seem to care about sanity. Only 2 hegemony ships escaped the Battle of New Hokkaido's flagship limped away with half her crew dead and her weapons systems destroyed. A single destroyer made it to the jump gate before the humans could intercept her. 12 ships had entered the system. 2 left. Nearly 20,000 hegemony personnel were dead or captured. The humans had lost every ship they deployed. Their crews had died to the last person, but they had won. News of the battle spread across human space within hours. Governor's face appeared on screens again, this time with a simple message. The fire had been lit. The time for patience was over. Within a week, 17 human worlds were in open revolt. The pattern was always the same. Supplies that had been stockpiled in secret were distributed. Weapons that had been hidden in warehouses and basements and buried in backyards were dug up. Hegemony administrators were arrested, tried in front of hastily assembled courts, and executed on live broadcasts. The executions were not pretty. The humans did not make them quick. They wanted the galaxy to see what happened to those who had exploited them. Ambassador A watched the recordings with growing dread. She had been recalled to consult with the High Council on the human crisis. They did not understand what they were seeing. They could not understand. The hegemony had dealt with rebellions before. They followed a predictable pattern. Initial anger, violent outbursts, then slow defeat as the rebels realized they could not win. Species learned to submit. That was how the galaxy worked. The humans were not following the pattern. Their rebellion was not spontaneous. It was coordinated. Uprisings on different worlds used the same tactics, the same codes, the same organizational structures. Human freighter captains who had spent years mapping hegemony supply routes suddenly began providing that information to resistance cells. Human engineers who had been quietly studying alien technology started building weapons that should have been beyond their capability. A presented her analysis to the High Council. They sat in their ancient chamber, representatives of the 12 founding species of the hegemony, and they listened to her describe the end of their world. She told them that the humans had been planning this for years, not just since New Hokkaido, since the very beginning. Since the first trade agreements were signed, they had smiled and nodded and taken everything the hegemony offered while quietly preparing for the day they would bite back. A council member asked how this was possible. How could the humans have hidden such a massive conspiracy? A made the sound that her species used for bitter laughter. The humans had not hidden it, she said. They had done it openly. They had built their bunkers and called them emergency shelters. They had stockpiled weapons and called them historical collections. They had trained their children in combat and called them sports leagues and reenactment societies. The hegemony had seen all of it. They had simply not been able to imagine a species that prepared for war the way they breathed. The council demanded solutions. I had none to offer. The humans were outnumbered and outproduced by factors of thousands. By every rational calculation, they should lose. But the humans, she said, had never cared much about rational calculations. The war had barely begun, and already the galaxy was starting to burn. Part 3. The war lasted 11 years. Later, historians would try to explain how it was possible. The hegemony controlled 600 inhabited worlds. They had trillions of citizens, millions of warships, industrial capacity that dwarfed anything humanity could hope to match. By every metric that mattered, the outcome should have been predetermined. The humans did not care about metrics. They fought a war that no other species would have fought. They used tactics that the hegemony had never imagined because no sane civilization would consider them. They turned their supposed weaknesses into weapons. The hegemony had always said that humans were violent. The humans proved them right. In the third year of the war, human agents began targeting food production instead of military installations. They introduced biological agents to agricultural worlds, engineered plagues that killed crops but left people alive. Billions of hegemony citizens faced starvation. Then the humans offered help. They arrived on the dying worlds with ships full of food. They asked for nothing in return except one thing: information. The locations of supply depots, the routes of patrol ships, the names of officials who had overseen human exploitation. Desperate people will trade almost anything for food. The humans knew this. They had learned it from their own history, from centuries of watching each other starve. In the 5th year of the war, the first non-human species joined the rebellion. There were a reptilian people who had been absorbed into the hegemony 800 years before. They had been docile subjects ever since, their warrior tradition suppressed, their history rewritten. But they remembered. Somewhere deep in their collective memory, they remembered what it felt like to fight. Human agents found them, taught them, armed them. The hegemony's own weapons turned against them in the hands of a species they had considered completely broken. They were not alone. Across the hegemony, dozens of subject species began to wake up. They had been told for generations that resistance was impossible. The humans showed them it was not by winning because the humans were not winning, but by refusing to lose. That was the lesson the humans taught: not how to win, how to fight, how to keep fighting when everything said you should give up, how to make the enemy bleed for every inch of ground until they started to wonder if the ground was worth the blood. By the 7th year of the war, the hegemony was fighting on 200 fronts. Their economy, built on the assumption of stable exploitation, could not handle the chaos. Supply lines that had functioned perfectly for centuries began to break down. Worlds that had been peaceful for suddenly required military occupation. Admiral Wei emerged as the face of human resistance during the 8th year. He was an unremarkable man by human standards. Short, quiet, with gray hair and a soft voice that made people lean in to hear him. He had been a logistics officer before the war, more comfortable with spreadsheets than speeches. But he understood something that the hegemony's generals did not. He understood that this was not a war of battles. It was a war of systems. Every hegemony ship destroyed meant nothing if the factories kept building more. Every world liberated would be retaken if the supply lines stayed intact. So did not fight the hegemony's military. He fought their economy. Human raiders targeted cargo ships instead of warships. They burned fuel depots instead of space stations. They assassinated industrial managers instead of generals. The hegemony could replace soldiers. They could not easily replace the bureaucrats who kept their civilization running. By the ninth year, the hegemony's economy had collapsed. Worlds that had never known shortage suddenly had no medicine, no fuel, no food. The carefully maintained systems that had kept hundreds of species fed and housed and controlled simply stopped working. The rebellion spread faster than the hegemony could respond. Former subject species discovered that their masters were not invincible. They were just organized. An organization could be disrupted. In the 10th year, the unthinkable happened. The war reached the not human ships. The humans were still too few, too weak, to directly threaten the heart of the hegemony. But the species they had armed, the rebellions they had nurtured, the chaos they had created, all of it finally reached the world that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. The siege was led by the and 4 other species who had been subject races. They came with ships built in secret, weapons designed from human blueprints, tactics learned from human teachers. They came with 800 years of suppressed anger finally given an outlet. Ambassador watched from her estate as the sky filled with enemy vessels. She had known this day would come. She had been warning her people since the very beginning, but there was no satisfaction in being right. There was only grief for everything that was about to be lost. She was the one they sent to negotiate the peace. The meeting took place on a neutral station, far from any contested space. Arrived with a small delegation, unarmed, carrying nothing but the authority to speak for what remained of the hegemony. Admiral arrived alone. He was smaller than she had expected, soft-spoken. There were lines on his face that had not been there in the old recordings, and his hair had gone completely gray. But his eyes were sharp, and they studied her with the same predatory attention she had noticed in humans from the very beginning. They sat across from each other at a plain metal table, 2 representatives of civilizations that had been trying to destroy each other for more than a decade. A spoke first. She said that the hegemony was prepared to offer terms. She said that they would recognize human sovereignty. They would withdraw from all human-occupied worlds. They would pay reparations for the damages they had caused. Listened without expression. Continued. She said that in exchange, the humans would need to stop supporting the other rebellions. They would need to help restore order to the sectors they had destabilized. They would need to be reasonable. Was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked what the hegemony would offer the other species who had risen up, the billions of beings who had finally found the courage to fight for their freedom. I had expected this question. She said that those were internal hegemony matters. The humans had no standing to negotiate on behalf of other species. Smiled, it was not a happy smile. He said that the humans had given those species weapons, training, hope. He said that the humans had promised them nothing except the chance to fight. What those species did with that chance was their own business. I felt something cold settle in her chest. She had hoped foolishly that the humans might be willing to help contain the chaos they had created, that they might see the value in a stable galaxy, even one that had wronged them. She asked directly. She asked if the humans understood what they had done. They had shattered an order that had kept the peace for 1,000 years. They had armed species who might turn on humanity next. They had unleashed forces that no one could control. Was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I would remember for the rest of her long life. He said that the hegemony had looked at humans and seen savages, animals to be exploited, controlled, relocated when convenient. He said that the hegemony had built their entire strategy around the belief that humans were violent and stupid and could be managed like any other primitive species. He said that the hegemony had been right about the violent part. He said that they had been wrong to think that made humans weak. I asked why the humans had not simply destroyed the hegemony entirely. They had the alliances. They had the momentum. They could have burned the way the hegemony had burned so many others. Said that the humans did not want to rule anyone. They never had. They just wanted to be left alone. They wanted to build their own future without someone else's boot on their neck. He said that the other species who had risen up deserved the same chance. What they built with that chance was their business. Maybe some of them would become friends. Maybe some would become enemies. That was the price of freedom. The treaty was signed the next day. Humanity asked for nothing but recognition of their sovereignty and a seat at the Galactic Council. They received both. They also received something that could not be written into any agreement: respect. Not affection, not gratitude, respect. The kind given to something dangerous that has proven it cannot be safely ignored. In the decades that followed, the old hegemony fractured into 100 successor states. Wars flared and faded. New alliances formed and dissolved. The galaxy became a more chaotic place, more dangerous in some ways, but also more free. Humanity carved out their own corner of that chaos. They built their colonies and stations and ships. They traded with whoever wanted to trade. They fought whoever needed to be fought. They made mistakes and learned from them, the way all species must. But they also became something unexpected. When conflicts threatened to spiral out of control, when species who had no history of diplomacy needed someone to mediate, they often turned to the humans. Not because humans were wise or gentle, not because they had some special gift for peace. They turned to humans because everyone remembered what humans were capable of. Everyone remembered the war. The humans who had burned half the galaxy to earn their freedom became, slowly, the ones who helped keep the peace. Not by threatening violence, though everyone knew the threat was there, but by understanding both sides of every conflict. By knowing what it felt like to be powerless and what it felt like to fight against impossible odds. Ambassador A lived long enough to see this transformation. She had retired from public service after the war, retreating to her estate to write her memoirs and watch the galaxy change. She was very old by the time a human journalist came to interview her about the early contact period. The journalist asked what she had learned from humanity, what lesson she would pass on to future generations. A thought about it for a long time. She thought about the first day she had landed on Earth, surrounded by soft little creatures she could have killed with a swipe of her forelimbs. She thought about Governor's smile. She thought about Admiral's quiet voice explaining why humanity would not help control the chaos they had created. She said that the lesson was simple. She said that every species thinks of itself as civilized. They build their cities and their laws and their empires, and they tell themselves that they have moved beyond their violent past. They look at others who are still fighting and dying and struggling, and they call those others savages. But civilization is not a destination. It is a choice, made every day by every person, and the choice to be peaceful only matters if you are also capable of violence. The humans had never forgotten that. They had never let themselves believe that their capacity for destruction had been bred out of them by progress. They kept their claws sharp, even while building beautiful things. That, I said, was the lesson. The hegemony had feared savages. The humans had proved them right. And in doing so, they had reminded the entire galaxy of a truth that too many species had forgotten. Peace is not the absence of the ability to make war. It is the choice not to. And that choice only means something if the alternative is real. The journalist thanked her and left. I sat alone in her garden, watching the sky darken toward evening. Somewhere up there, human ships were patrolling trade routes alongside vessels. Human diplomats were negotiating treaties in halls where her species had once ruled absolutely. Human children were growing up in a galaxy that was more dangerous, more chaotic, and more free than any generation before them had ever known. They had feared savages. The humans had proved them right. And then they had proved something more, that savages, properly motivated, could break chains that had held for 1,000 years. A closed her eyes and let the evening wash over her. In the end, she thought, perhaps that was all that mattered.